In the Second Punic War, Hannibal Barca marched a Carthaginian army over the Alps into Roman Italy in 218 BC, an invasion that should have destroyed itself before it ever met the enemy. Rome was shocked, battles were won, panic spread, and yet the war did not end the way such a strategic shock is supposed to end. Why would a commander deliberately burn his own logistics just to appear where doctrine said he could not? Why did Rome, built to absorb military pain, still stumble when the impossible became real? And if this move was genius, why did it carry the seeds of strategic failure from the first step on the mountain? Because the Alps were not the plan. They were the weapon. In the next sections, we will dissect the assumptions, the internal risks, the mechanism of survival after the crossing, and the price that history prefers to romanticize. This episode is not about how Hannibal crossed the Alps. That story is already familiar and misleading. The real strategic problem is simpler and far more uncomfortable. Hannibal was facing a system he could not outproduce, outrecruit, or outlast. The Roman Republic could lose armies and replace them. It could lose battles and continue the war. It could absorb shock in a way Carthage could not. If Hannibal fought Rome the correct way, he would eventually be crushed by arithmetic, not tactics. So the question becomes unavoidable. What do you do when orthodox strategy guarantees a slow defeat? Hannibal's answer was not to seek a better battlefield. It was to attack the assumptions that made Roman strategy stable. Crossing the Alps was not an operational gamble for glory. It was an attempt to force Rome into a strategic identity crisis, to make its leaders doubt their geography, their alliances, and their sense of control. This is why the move was fundamentally unorthodox. It targeted cognition before territory, belief before fortifications. But this kind of strategy only works if several fragile assumptions hold at the same time. If even one collapses, the entire campaign collapses with it. And to understand how close this came to failure, we first need to map the situation Hannibal was trapped inside, before he ever reached the mountains. Because the Alps were not the beginning of the war. They were the result of a narrowing set of impossible choices. Before Hannibal ever faced snow, cliffs, or Roman legions, he was already boxed in by a strategic geometry that offered no clean exits. Rome and Carthage were not equals locked in a symmetric contest. They were asymmetric systems with radically different tolerances for loss, time, and failure. Rome's true strength was not its armies. It was its structure. A citizen base large enough to regenerate legions, a political culture that normalized catastrophic losses, and a network of Italian allies bound not by affection but by obligation and fear. Rome could afford to lose battles. Hannibal could not afford to fight a war of endurance. Carthage, by contrast, was a fractured power. Its military excellence relied on commanders in the field rather than a unified national mobilization. Its political leadership was divided, cautious, and reluctant to commit fully after earlier defeats. Hannibal did not command a war machine designed for replacement and recovery. He commanded a finite instrument. Every loss was permanent. Every delay increased Roman advantage. Time itself was an enemy. Geography made this imbalance worse. Rome controlled the seas. Any direct maritime invasion of Italy risked interception, attrition, or isolation. Southern Italy and Sicily were heavily contested and monitored. A conventional approach, advancing along the coast or reinforcing via naval supply, would place Hannibal exactly where Rome expected him to be, operating under Roman terms. On land, Roman defensive depth ensured that even a successful invasion would trigger a slow grinding response, not a decisive collapse. Politically, Rome appeared stable on the surface but brittle underneath. Its Italian allies supplied manpower, food, and legitimacy. But this system depended on a single belief: Rome could protect them. If that belief cracked, the alliance network might fracture. Hannibal understood this, but the problem was access. How do you appear inside Italy not as a raider, but as a permanent threat, without giving Rome months to prepare? Here lies the central constraint. Hannibal needed to enter Italy fast, unexpectedly, and with enough force to win battles immediately. He needed to do so without naval dominance, without a friendly land corridor, and without secure logistics. Any delay favored Rome. Any orthodox route led to interception. The map itself denied him a safe solution. From Rome's perspective, the situation looked comfortable. Their intelligence model assumed threats would emerge where movement was feasible. Natural barriers were treated as strategic filters. The Alps were not defended because they did not need to be. No state-sized army had crossed them to invade Italy at speed. This was not arrogance alone. It was a rational inference based on historical precedent, logistical reality, and risk assessment. That assumption, reasonable, empirical, and shared by most commanders of the era, was precisely what trapped Rome inside its own strategic expectations. Hannibal did not need Rome to be careless. He only needed Rome to be normal. And inside the closed system of constraints, with every conventional option leading towards slow defeat, one path remained, not because it was good, but because it was unthinkable. And it was from this dead-end logic that the idea of crossing the Alps began to look less like madness, and more like the last available move. Military doctrine in the ancient Mediterranean was built around control, predictability, and sustainment. Armies moved where supply could follow. Campaigns unfolded along known corridors. Commanders avoided terrain that erased formation discipline, slowed communication, and dissolved command authority. Mountains were not battlefields. They were obstacles to be bypassed, not crossed with intent. A correct commander confronting Rome in 218 BC would have chosen one of three orthodox options. First, a naval approach towards southern Italy or Sicily, accepting Roman naval pressure in exchange for proximity to supply and reinforcement. Second, a land advance along the coast through Gaul, maintaining contact with friendly or neutral populations and minimizing environmental attrition. Third, a defensive war in Iberia, forcing Rome to project power outward and stretching its resources over time. All three options shared a fatal flaw. They allowed Rome to fight the war it was designed to fight. A maritime invasion would arrive late, exposed, and fragmented. Roman fleets would detect, delay, and disrupt it. Even a successful landing would give Rome time to mobilize, reinforce, and absorb the blow. The campaign would stretch into a contest of endurance. Rome would win that contest. A coastal land advance was no better. It was slow, predictable, visible. Roman commanders could concentrate forces, deny favorable engagements, and trade space for time. Hannibal might win battles. He would not collapse the system. The war would grind forward, one replacement legion after another. A defensive posture in Iberia appeared cautious, even rational. But it conceded initiative. Rome could choose where and when to apply pressure. Hannibal would become reactive. His finite army would be tied down while Rome expanded the war geographically and politically. Doctrine promised safety. It promised control. What it did not promise was victory. The deeper problem was that Roman power was not concentrated in one decisive point. It was distributed across manpower, alliances, and institutional resilience. There was no single fortress to seize, no capital whose fall would end the war. Fighting Rome by orthodox means meant fighting its strengths. Hannibal faced a paradox that doctrine could not resolve. To threaten Rome strategically, he needed to be inside Italy quickly and unexpectedly. But every doctrinally approved route to Italy gave Rome time to respond. Speed required abandoning safety. Surprise required abandoning logistics. Shock required abandoning precedent. This is why the Alps mattered. Not as terrain, but as a doctrinal blind spot. No Roman plan accounted for a full-scale invasion through the mountains because no sane doctrine recommended it. No Carthaginian manual advised it either. That was precisely the point. By choosing a path that doctrine rejected outright, Hannibal was not trying to outmaneuver Roman armies. He was trying to bypass Roman thinking. But abandoning doctrine does not eliminate risk. It concentrates it. The question was no longer whether crossing the Alps was dangerous. That was obvious. The real question was whether following doctrine was more dangerous still. And once the conclusion was reached, the unorthodox decision did not emerge suddenly. It hardened under pressure, shaped by constraint, fear, and the absence of any safer alternative. The decision to cross the Alps did not appear as a single moment of inspiration. It formed under pressure, through elimination rather than creativity. Each conventional option collapsed under scrutiny, leaving behind a choice that survived not because it was elegant, but because it was still standing. Inside Hannibal's command structure, this was not a comfortable idea. An army does not drift into mountains by accident. Senior officers understood what the terrain would do to cohesion, to discipline, to animals, to supply. Veterans of earlier campaigns knew how quickly morale could disintegrate once units lost rhythm and predictability. The proposal did not promise advantage. It promised exposure. What pushed the decision forward was not confidence, but constraint. Hannibal's strategic window was closing. Roman mobilization cycles were accelerating. Intelligence indicated that Rome expected conflict, but not invasion at speed. Delay would convert surprise into preparedness. Every week spent debating increased Roman control of the initiative. At the core of the plan were several fragile assumptions. First, that an army could survive the crossing with enough combat power intact to fight immediately. Not eventually. Immediately. A force that emerged exhausted and disorganized would be hunted down before it could stabilize. Second, that Roman allies in northern Italy would hesitate or defect once Hannibal appeared in their rear. This was not guaranteed. It was a bet on political psychology under shock. Third, that Rome's command structure would react aggressively rather than cautiously, seeking battle to reassert control. Hannibal needed Rome to engage emotionally, not strategically. This was not a plan to destroy Rome's armies outright. It was a plan to destabilize Rome's decision-making environment. The Alps were chosen not because they offered tactical advantage, but because they erased Roman expectations. They collapsed the map Rome thought it was reading. The internal risk was immense. If morale cracked during the march, the army would fragment. If local tribes resisted instead of cooperating, losses would compound. If weather delayed movement, the timing advantage vanished. There was no redundancy. No second route. No recovery mechanism. What makes this decision genuinely unorthodox is not that it was bold. It is that it accepted the loss of control as the price of relevance. Hannibal chose a strategy where he could not manage every variable, because the alternatives guaranteed strategic irrelevance. This reframes the decision entirely. The Alps were not selected as a clever maneuver. They were selected as a forcing mechanism, on Rome, on allies, and on Hannibal's own army. Once committed, retreat was no longer an option psychologically or strategically. From this point forward, the campaign could not be adjusted. It could only succeed or collapse. And that meant the real test of the strategy would not be the idea itself, but whether it could survive contact with terrain, weather, fear, and chance. Execution is where unorthodox strategy either reveals its logic, or exposes itself as self-destruction. On paper, crossing the Alps was a conceptual strike. On the ground, it became a prolonged test of whether an army could remain an army when every system designed to hold it together was stripped away. The march immediately dismantled the normal architecture of command. Formations dissolved into columns. Units lost visual contact. Orders traveled slowly, often too late to matter. Terrain dictated movement, not officers. This alone carried a hidden risk rarely discussed. Authority in ancient armies was spatial. When soldiers could no longer see their commanders, discipline weakened. Hannibal's control depended less on command and more on momentum. Logistics ceased to function in any recognizable form. Supply trains broke apart. Animals slipped, froze, or died. Food distribution became uneven and improvised. Hunger was not merely a physical problem. It corroded morale and trust. Soldiers began to question whether survival, not victory, had become the true objective. At this stage, the strategy was already consuming its own future. The first critical failure point was time. The crossing took longer than ideal. Weather and resistance from mountain tribes slowed movement. Every additional day increased attrition and risked Roman detection. Speed was not a preference, it was the mechanism that made the strategy viable. Delay did not just weaken the army, it threatened to nullify the shock Hannibal was counting on. The second failure point was cohesion. Losses were not evenly distributed. Some units arrived relatively intact. Others were shattered. This created imbalance. An army that emerges uneven is tactically unstable. Hannibal now faced the challenge of reorganizing under pressure, in hostile territory, with no secure rear. There was no pause. Rome would not wait. A micro-twist emerged here, often glossed over. Local populations in northern Italy did not immediately rally en masse. Some hesitated. Some watched. Some resisted. Hannibal's assumption that shock would automatically translate into support proved only partially correct. This forced him to divert attention and resources to stabilize his position instead of pressing advantage. The window narrowed further. Another risk was psychological fatigue. Soldiers had survived something that doctrine said should kill them. That can produce confidence or fragility. Victory narratives had not yet formed. There was only exhaustion. Hannibal needed immediate success to convert survival into belief. Without it, the army might fracture from within. Execution also revealed the most dangerous feature of the strategy: irreversibility. Losses in the mountains could not be replaced. Equipment could not be restored. Animals could not be conjured. Every kilometer forward locked Hannibal deeper into a campaign where margin for error approached zero. And yet, the strategy did not collapse. Not immediately. Hannibal emerged into Italy with enough force to fight. Not comfortably. Not sustainably. But sufficiently. This is where the strategy seemed to justify itself. Rome had not prepared for this vector. Commanders scrambled. Intelligence lagged. The map no longer matched reality. But this apparent success masked a deeper structural problem. The strategy had succeeded in arrival, but not in transformation. The Roman system was disrupted, but not dismantled. Hannibal had achieved presence. He had not yet achieved leverage. The execution phase exposes the truth often hidden by romantic retellings. Crossing the Alps was not a singular heroic act. It was a sequence of near failures that accumulated strategic debt. Every problem solved consumed resources that could not be replaced. Every improvisation bought time at the cost of endurance. The campaign survived its most fragile phase, but emerged weaker than the logic of the plan required. And once Hannibal stood on Italian soil, the burden of proof shifted, because now Rome had to decide how to respond, and whether to play the game Hannibal was forcing upon them. Rome did not panic because it was irrational. It panicked because its strategic grammar had been violated. An enemy army was inside Italy without having passed through the gates Rome had spent centuries reinforcing. The problem was not Hannibal's presence alone. It was the implication that Roman geography, long treated as a strategic asset, had failed. The first Roman reactions were driven by restoration, not adaptation. Commanders sought to reassert control by forcing engagement. The assumption was simple and deeply ingrained: a foreign army operating without secure logistics must be fragile. Find it. Fix it. Destroy it. This logic was not foolish. It was doctrinally sound. It was also exactly what Hannibal needed Rome to believe. Roman intelligence struggled in this phase. Information arrived fragmented and late. Reports from the north contradicted established threat models. There was no shared understanding of Hannibal's condition, his numbers, or his intent. In the absence of clarity, Roman commanders defaulted to precedent. Precedent said that decisive battle restored order. This is where Rome reacted incorrectly, not because it was incompetent, but because its system rewarded confidence over caution. Roman political culture favored action. Delay looked like weakness. Avoidance looked like fear. To not confront Hannibal risked signaling vulnerability to allies already watching closely. Hannibal exploited this pressure. He did not need Rome to misunderstand everything. He only needed Rome to misunderstand him. His army appeared battered, isolated, and desperate for supplies. That image encouraged pursuit. It encouraged engagement. It encouraged Rome to believe that one or two hard blows could end the problem. The deeper misreading lay in Roman assumptions about sustainability. Rome believed Hannibal was racing against starvation. In reality, Hannibal was racing against time, but for a different reason. He needed Rome to commit emotionally before it committed strategically. Every aggressive Roman move validated his premise that shock would trigger overreaction. At the same time, Roman command structure worked against rapid recalibration. Authority was divided. Command rotated. Lessons learned in one engagement did not always translate into immediate systemic change. Rome could adapt, but not instantly. Hannibal's strategy lived inside that delay. Yet this phase also reveals the limit of the unorthodox approach. Roman losses, even when severe, did not destabilize the Republic. New legions formed. Allies hesitated but largely held. Rome began, slowly, to learn. It stopped chasing annihilation and started managing exposure. The very flexibility Hannibal sought to break began to reassert itself. The Roman response, initially misaligned, did not remain static. Once Rome accepted that the war would not end quickly, it shifted posture. It absorbed shock. It stretched the conflict. It refused to give Hannibal the decisive engagement he needed to convert presence into collapse. This moment marks the strategic inflection point. Hannibal had succeeded in forcing Rome to react incorrectly, temporarily. But the Roman system, built for duration, was beginning to adjust. And that raises the most uncomfortable question of the entire campaign: what happens to an unorthodox strategy once the enemy stops being surprised? Because from this point on, the war would no longer be decided by audacity, but by endurance, and by who could afford to keep paying the price. By the time the immediate shock of Hannibal's arrival faded, the results of the Alpine strategy were undeniable, and deeply paradoxical. Tactically, Rome had been wounded. Strategically, Rome remained intact. Hannibal had won battles, inflicted disproportionate losses, and demonstrated that Roman armies could be beaten decisively in the field. Yet none of this translated into the systemic collapse the strategy implicitly required. The direct outcome was asymmetry without closure. Hannibal achieved freedom of maneuver inside Italy. He forced Rome to divert resources, rethink deployments, and fight under psychological pressure. The myth of invulnerability cracked. But the Roman state did not fracture. Its political institutions continued to function. Its alliance network bent but did not break. Its manpower pool, though strained, remained regenerative. This is where the cost of the strategy becomes visible, not in one catastrophic moment, but as a slow accumulation of irreversible losses. The human cost came first and never stopped. The army that emerged from the Alps was no longer a force designed for long war. Veterans carried exhaustion forward into every engagement. Replacements were scarce. Every fallen soldier reduced not just combat power, but institutional memory. Hannibal could win tactically and still grow weaker. Rome could lose tactically and grow stronger. The logistical cost was structural. Hannibal never rebuilt a secure supply system. Foraging replaced provisioning. Local cooperation replaced guaranteed support. This meant constant movement, constant pressure, and constant exposure. The army lived at the edge of sustainability. Any prolonged stalemate favored Rome. Any delay compounded scarcity. Politically, the strategy failed to generate the cascade it needed. Italian allies watched closely, but most did not defect in sufficient numbers. Hannibal's presence inspired fear and admiration, but fear did not equal rebellion. Rome's long-established mechanisms of control, hostages, incentives, legal frameworks, proved more resilient than expected. The assumption that shock would override loyalty held only partially, and only temporarily. There was also a cost that history often avoids discussing: the psychological burden on the commander himself. Hannibal had committed to a path with no exit. Retreat would mean admission of failure. Stagnation meant slow death. Every decision after the Alps was constrained by the original gamble. Flexibility narrowed. Options collapsed inward. The strategy that created freedom of action also eliminated strategic reversibility. This raises the hardest assessment. Did the strategy fail because it was flawed, or because the enemy adapted? One interpretation argues that Hannibal miscalculated Rome's capacity for absorption. That he mistook panic for collapse. That he underestimated the durability of Roman institutions. Under this view, the Alpine strategy was tactically brilliant but strategically incomplete. It solved the problem of access, not the problem of termination. Another interpretation is harsher. It suggests that no strategy available to Hannibal could have defeated Rome outright under those conditions. That the Alps were not a mistake, but the least bad option in a losing war. That the cost was inevitable, and the alternative was faster defeat elsewhere. In this reading, the strategy did not fail. It merely revealed the limits of what was possible. What cannot be denied is that the strategy consumed its own future. It front-loaded risk, shock, and loss in exchange for tempo. Once tempo was gone, there was nothing left to trade. Rome could reset. Hannibal could not. The outcome, then, is not victory or defeat in the conventional sense. It is exposure. Exposure of how far audacity can carry a weaker system, and where it inevitably breaks. Exposure of the difference between disrupting an enemy and dismantling one. Exposure of the cost of betting everything on the hope that surprise will do what force cannot. Hannibal's campaign after the Alps became a study in diminishing returns. Each additional success yielded less strategic leverage. Each year of survival required greater effort. The initial brilliance cast a long shadow that made the eventual stalemate feel like failure, even when measured against impossible odds. This is why the strategy remains debated. Not because its execution was unclear, but because its meaning is uncomfortable. It challenges the idea that genius guarantees outcomes. It forces a confrontation with the limits of unorthodox warfare when faced with a system designed to endure. And that leaves us with the final task, not to judge the decision as right or wrong, but to understand what it truly represents. Because to decode this campaign fully, we must step back from the events themselves and ask what this strategy actually teaches us about power, limits, and the price of breaking the rules. At a distance of 2 millennia, it is tempting to treat Hannibal's Alpine crossing as a question of brilliance versus failure. That framing is too small. The strategy does not belong to the category of moves that win wars. It belongs to a more uncomfortable category, strategies that exist only because all orthodox paths lead to certain defeat. The campaign was never about defeating Rome in battle. It was about rewriting the conditions under which Rome made decisions. Hannibal understood something fundamental that doctrine often obscures: wars are not decided only by force ratios, but by whether a system can be forced to behave against its own long-term interests. The Alps were a tool to test that possibility. This strategy shattered several assumptions at once. It broke the rule that geography is a stable defensive asset. It broke the rule that logistics must precede maneuver. It broke the rule that a weaker power must conserve strength. In doing so, it demonstrated a brutal principle: sometimes survival requires violating the very rules designed to preserve you. But the campaign also exposed a second, deeper truth. Unorthodox strategies do not eliminate structure. They only exploit its rigidity. Once the structure adapts, the advantage collapses. Hannibal's plan depended on Rome reacting emotionally, urgently, and predictably. When Rome learned to absorb shock, avoid decisive battle, and stretch the war, the logic of the strategy inverted. What had once been an asymmetric advantage became an asymmetric liability. The lesson is not that shock is useless. It is that shock has a half-life. It decays the moment the enemy accepts the new reality. From that point onward, an unorthodox strategy must either transform into something sustainable, or die under the weight of its own initial sacrifices. Hannibal could not transform. His strategy had no second phase that did not require resources he could not regenerate. There is also a quieter lesson here, one rarely stated openly. Strategic genius is often indistinguishable from strategic desperation. The Alps were not crossed because they were optimal. They were crossed because they were available. This forces a re-evaluation of how we judge commanders operating under constraint. Sometimes the most radical decision is not an expression of confidence, but an admission that all safer options are already lost. Most importantly, this campaign reveals the difference between disruption and destruction. Hannibal disrupted Rome. He exposed its assumptions. He forced adaptation. But he did not destroy the system that allowed Rome to recover. Against a state designed for replacement, endurance, and learning, brilliance alone was insufficient. This is why the strategy still matters. Not as a manual to imitate, but as a diagnostic case. It shows how far audacity can push against structural power. It shows where that push fails. And it reminds us that breaking the rules is not the same as escaping their consequences. The Alpine crossing was not a mistake. It was a boundary test. It asked a single, dangerous question: how much can a weaker force distort reality before reality pushes back? The answer, written across the length of the war, is cold and precise. Enough to terrify an empire. Not enough to dismantle it. Hannibal did not lose because he lacked courage, intelligence, or tactical skill. He lost because his strategy demanded a collapse that Rome was structurally incapable of providing. The Alps gave him access, shock, and legend, but they also consumed his margin for error. In the end, this campaign stands as a warning embedded inside a masterpiece: when you break every rule to stay relevant, you must also find a way to survive once relevance is no longer enough. Some strategies change history. Others reveal its limits. This one did both.